In this lecture, we're going to look at multicultural education. Multicultural education in U.S. schools and society is taking on new dimensions of complexity and practicality as demographics, social conditions, and political circumstances change. Domestic diversity and unprecedented immigration have created a vibrant mixture of cultural, ethnic, linguistic, and experimental plurality. Many times whenever you ask a teacher what they think of multicultural education, they will say it is good, but I really don't know how to implement it. Or they'll say it's good, but I don't have time to implement it. So we're going to look at multicultural education in this chapter and just kind of discuss how we can bring it into our day-to-day lectures and all of our lessons. Because multicultural education shouldn't be just an add-on, it should be a part of all curriculum. This is right here. Accomplishing this end, or multicultural education, is becoming increasingly important as the 21st century unfolds. People coming from Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa differ greatly from earlier generations of immigrants who came primarily from Western and Northern Europe. You have to remember that there was, during the 1800s, that a lot of immigration came from different regions. And we got a lot of people from Europe, and we also got a lot of people some people from the Asia area came in as well. Well, that's what you see with the Chinese immigrants during the 1800s as well. But nowadays we're seeing immigrants coming from different regions. So our education system that we've created and our textbooks that we have written are not really addressing the multiculturalism for all those different groups that are coming in. We always see it as a melting pot, but it really hasn't melted. When people come to America, even if they're first or second generations in, that doesn't mean that it's a tabula rasa situation where it's a blank slate. They still hold cultural identities of their ancestors. So we really can't just say, okay, this formula right here works. And that's why multicultural education tries to strengthen curriculum by helping address everyone's culture within their school setting. Scroll down right here. And this is where we see one of our first sections, and that is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois proposed that the problem of the 20th century was conflict and controversy among racial groups, particularly between African and European Americans. He concluded, and this is his quote, "Between these two worlds, black and white, despite much physical contact and daily intermingling, there is almost no community of intellectual life or point of transference where the thoughts and feelings of one race can come into direct contact and sympathy with the thoughts and feelings of the other." Now this was 110 years ago when he's making these statements. So, and that's where you have to look at the race issue of that time. They were saying, well, blacks and whites, they're learning from one another. And he was saying, even though that black people were working for white people as sharecroppers, that they were having daily interactions. However, the transfer of the culture and just the way of life was not being discussed. You may say to someone, how are you doing today? But you don't know how they're doing in their culture, how their life is, how they're living. So that's what he says, that this transference is not occurring. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois was also the first African American with a PhD from Harvard, and that he also helps create the NAACP. And I'm going to have a video that I'm going to show you on W.E.B. Du Bois, and I'll do that right now. But W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the first truly educated African American leaders of the civil rights movement, because you'll see he was ahead of his time, but he was also a product of his time. But he is like, the best way I can describe it is he is the Dr. Martin Luther King of the 1900s, even though King came in the 1960s. So he wrote a lot of good pieces and just very good. And he would have conflict later with Booker T. Washington, which you can read up on that as well. And so we'll go ahead and watch a video quickly on W.E.B. Du Bois.
William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, later known as W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, on February 23, 1868. As a young man, Du Bois received a B.A. from Fisk University before becoming the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1895.
What is impressive about W.E.B. Du Bois, when he went to Harvard, they wouldn't accept his 4-year Fisk degree. Du Bois also faced the problem of not being allowed to stay on the Harvard campus after 6 p.m. So if you put it in context historically, it was a great feat.
While teaching at Atlanta University, Du Bois produced a number of academic works, including The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, the first case study of a black community in the United States.
Du Bois went into these blighted areas. He found a population that had terrible health issues, a lot of social ills such as poverty, high infant mortality, prostitution. He didn't entirely excuse the African American population, but in his analysis, he was very forceful about pointing out racism as a reason for a lot of these ills.
Both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington emerged as advocates of their race. However, as an alternative voice to Washington's book, Up From Slavery, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903.
It was an absolutely unique book. It contains poetry, autobiographical sketches, historical articles, memoir, a wide-ranging representation of the diversity of black experience.
In 1905, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, opposing Booker T. Washington's racial accommodation theory. The organization became the forerunner of the NAACP, and years later, Du Bois was appointed editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis.
Du Bois wanted the crisis to have two main components: protest on the one hand and uplift on the other. At the same time that he was protesting lynching and race riots, he was building a consciousness.
While continuing his work for civil rights, Du Bois published his first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, in 1911. 4 years later, he published The Negro, the first general history of black Africans.
He was one of the early scholars who felt like you could not understand the status and condition of blacks in the United States unless you came to terms with the status and condition of Africa.
In 1920, Du Bois published the first of his 3 autobiographies, entitled Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil. Then in 1935, Du Bois published his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America.
With his 3 autobiographies, and in a sense you could say his body of work, Du Bois gave us a document of what it was like to be black in the American century.
While becoming more influenced by communism, Du Bois made a losing bid for the New York State Senate at the age of 82. By 1961, Du Bois joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana, where he died on August 27, 1963.
W.E.B. Du Bois can be deemed arguably the most profound African-American intellectual of his generation. His ideas are still highly relevant for the present generation of scholars.
So that was an interesting video on W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm going to add a video to the end of this lecture, and it talks about what I highlighted before about the W.E.B. Du Bois kind of versus Booker T. Washington. I don't want to make it sound like there was a war between the two, but you'll see in the video, it's a good video because it talks to a professor of African Studies, and he knows a lot about it. So I'll add that at the end, and that's just it's a 9-minute clip where this guy's interviewing a professor, and he talks about the Booker T. Washington and the W.E.B. Du Bois, kind of a split on higher education for African Americans. We don't want to think that multicultural education is just race-based. We want to look at it on all different cultures. So, but that's one of the first elements of multicultural education is when you start looking at race. But then you want to go beyond that. There's right here it says the conceptions of multicultural education. Even though some theorists have argued that multicultural education is a necessary ingredient of quality education, in actual practice, educators most often perceive it either as an addendum prompted by some crisis or as a luxury. So what this little, I'll attach this PDF with this chapter so you can read. But what this section right here discusses is it talks about how many people view multicultural education as an add-on to some days of lessons. So you say, okay, I need to do multicultural education now. But we need to get away from that, and we need to say that multicultural education is part of the education system. Another obstacle to implementing multicultural education lies with teachers themselves. Many are unconvinced of its worth or its value developing academic skills and building a unified national community. Even though teachers are accepting of multicultural education, many of them say, I would do it if I could or if I really comprehended the whole element of it, but also do I have time? So we want to get away from multicultural education as an add-on. This next little video clip is from the TED series, and it shows you multicultural education when you look at the turn of the century in the American West. She does a really good job. It's about 10 to 11 minutes long, and I just want you to see the way she teaches multicultural education, and she gets away from the idea of it being an add-on.
So it's important for me to say that I am here as a parent guardian from the Denver Public Schools, and I just want to thank the organizers for inviting a parent voice into this venue. I really appreciate the opportunity. I also just accepted a job with the Adams 14 school district, so I got to do a little shout out for Adams 14. You know, most TED Talks talk about a new idea or a big idea. I'm talking about a really old idea. It's been around for decades. I'm talking about multiculturalism. We were talking about it in 1978, and we're still talking about it today. Because it's been around for such a long time, it can mean different things to different people. So I want to talk about some multicultural practices that I'm not talking about today. I am not talking about food and festivals or heroes and holidays. Okay, these sorts of things can be really fun. They're very easy to do, and if they're authentic to the cultures that are represented in our school, they can be really fun community builders. But they also come with some risks. One of the things that I see a lot out here is I see things on the school menu. We'll have tacos in celebration of Cinco de Mayo. We'll have fried chicken for Martin Luther King Day. We'll have soul food on the menu during Black History Month. And again, these sorts of things can be fun, but they also run the risk of sort of reinforcing stereotypes, and they also run the risk of trivializing things that are really, really quite important. So how many people here think most of your students have heard of Cinco de Mayo? Right? And so if y'all had, I use y'all as a gender-neutral pronoun, if y'all had tacos on your menu as your students are biting into that taco, are they thinking about Mexican resistance to French occupation? Is that what they're thinking about? No. So it runs the risk of sort of trivializing something that is actually quite important. Oops, can you go back one? I'm also not talking about something we do a lot in early childhood classrooms, which is when we bring in stories from all over the world, right? Kind of that folklore and sort of fables approach. Again, this is something that's really easy to do. It's also a way to kind of ensure that our children, our diverse children in a classroom, see somebody who looks like them and what they're reading in the classroom. It's a really easy thing to do. But I want to remind everybody that the value of multicultural content is not just about where a story comes from. It's also about the messages that the story relays to the reader. Last year in her second grade literacy class, my daughter was reading a multicultural anthology. One of the stories that was included in that anthology was a story called The Selkie Girl, which is a traditional Celtic tale. And if I were to summarize this story, it's basically about a man who gets obsessed with a magical seal woman. So I'm going to read one paragraph from this story. He went to look in wonder and delight. He saw 3 beautiful girls sitting on the rocks, naked, combing their hair. One of the girls had fair hair, one red and one black. The fair-haired girl was singing. She was the most beautiful of the 3, and he could not take his eyes from her. He gazed and gazed at her gleaming white body. Okay? This was my daughter's response to that story. I would say it was my response as well. So when you are using sort of the stories from around the world approach, remember that the messages matter. The messages of the story matter as much as where the stories come from. To be fair to my child, this is what Zoe looks like happy. Okay? So if I'm not talking about food and festivals or heroes or holidays or folklore and fables, what am I talking about? I am talking about the kind of the kind of multiculturalism that's characterized by three basic things. It is rigorous in terms of content and instruction. It's very rigorous. It supports all that skill building we're so concerned about. It also is designed, particularly with instruction, to advance students' pro-social capacities. And that's a big phrase that just means our students can look at issues from multiple points of view, and they can work collaboratively in diverse groups. That's what pro-social proficiencies are. And the third thing that the kind of multiculturalism that I'm talking about does is that it advances social justice. But let's talk about that term for a second. Last fall in the Denver Public Schools, we had a little kerfuffle. DPS rolled out a draft of the new teacher evaluation protocol, and it included some elements that related to this term, social justice. And so it brought out some pretty significant responses in our community. To some people in our community, if we focus on social justice, that means we're going to turn all of our children into socialists who hate white people. Okay? This, of course, this kind of response then brought out people from the other end of the spectrum who said, if we don't have an emphasis on social justice in our schools, that just means our schools will serve to reinforce the white supremacist, heterosexist oligarchy. And by the way, so, right? So if you get hung up on the social justice term, if it's not a term that works well for you, I'm going to take a cue from our school superintendent, Tom Boasberg, when we were having this kerfuffle in DPS, who just came back and said, we want our kids to be critical thinkers. Multiculturalists are interested in our children being able to look at issues from multiple points of view, work collaboratively with each other, and really kind of solve problems. So the kind of multiculturalism that I'm talking about is the kind that is rigorous academically, content and instruction. It advances pro-social proficiency, particularly through instruction, and it advances social justice or critical thinking, whatever term you're most comfortable with. So one of the schools that I have the privilege of being involved in Denver Public Schools, is Highline Academy Charter School. I'm the board president there. That's a volunteer position where I work full-time. Highline Academy is a K-8 public charter school authorized by Alyssa, authorized by the Denver Public Schools. We are a purposefully integrated school, and we mean that like in the old school way. We are 50% of color and 50% white. That's on purpose, and the demographics of Southeast Denver allow us to do that. We're also what we call, literally we made this up, we are a core knowledge plus school. Those of you who know core knowledge, if you don't know core knowledge, what it basically is, it's a sequence and a scaffolded set of content that spirals up through the grade levels, and it's a really useful tool because it allows us to make sure that, you know, our kids aren't reading the I Have a Dream speech every year when they do Martin Luther King Day, right? It just allows us to create shared knowledge in second grade that is then built upon in the fifth grade. So when Zoe, my daughter, was in second grade last year, this was when they had their first introduction to westward expansion. And it was, now Highline we're a core knowledge plus school because we supplement our content a lot to make sure it meets the needs of our diverse learners. And when Zoe got into this westward expansion unit, it was a whole bunch of O Pioneer, wagon trains, river boats, trains, and very based sort of in this manifest destiny mentality. And that is a perfectly valid way to teach westward expansion. It really is. because westward expansion was really, really good for a lot of people, and we probably would not be here today had it not unfolded the way that it did. But westward expansion was not good for everybody. And I was really worried that Zoe was only getting sort of half of the story. And so I sat down and I thought to myself, okay, what is it I really want her to know by the end of this unit? What do I want her to be able to answer? And I wanted her to be able to think about how can progress be both positive and negative? That's really what I wanted her to be able to reflect on with this unit. And so we supplemented a lot. We brought in the core knowledge sequence, for example, includes a short story that's told from the perspective of a pioneer girl who's going out on the road, right? And so we Venn diagram, early grades teacher's best friend. We did a Venn diagram activity using a story about a Bitterroot Salish girl who was being forcibly removed from her home. That was one way. We brought in fiction, nonfiction. We brought in poetry from the Choctaw. We brought in, an important thing that we brought in were resistance narratives, because when you teach history, particularly this episode of history, it's almost like it's a foregone conclusion. But there was massive resistance to policies of Indian removal. We certainly taught some of the resistance narratives from Native America, but we also made a point to do resistance narratives from white folks. The ladies of Steubenville, Ohio, a group of Quaker women who wrote to Congress asking them to be more equitable. A U.S. senator who gave a 6-hour-long speech on the floor of Congress asking folks to reject the Indian Removal Act. We brought in lots and lots of different things. And by the end of the unit, my child and many others could answer, or at least reflect on, write about, that essential question. In what ways can progress be both positive and negative? They used all of their skills, their reading skills, their writing skills. We had mapping activities for geography. We had graphing activities for math. It was all sort of skill-based. It was very rigorous. For my child, she was really transformed, I would say, by this unit. It really sparked a passion for her. I took at least 3 trips to the Bookies, which is our little independent teacher bookstore in Southeast Denver, to get her nonfiction books about Native America, that kind of thing. And then she did the most incredible thing. She asked us to do something over spring break. She didn't want to go to camp. She didn't want to lay around and play video games. This is what she wanted to do. She wanted to go see the site of the Sand Creek Massacre because she had read about it in some of her books. So she was really, really motivated by this content. And you know that you're getting it right when the kids are doing it on their own time. You know you're getting it right. So between 2nd and 3rd grade, Zoe changed schools. She is now at the Denver Green School, which is, when it's fully enrolled, it'll be a K-8. And it's an innovation school, which means it's a traditional DPS school, but it's got its own kind of thing going on. It does have an environmental, if I could get some water, that would be helpful. It does have an environmental focus, but it's really built around around principles of sustainability. And it's a little different than environmentalism. So, for example, they are really interested in teaching children about the healthy commons. How do we protect the healthy commons? Thank you. Oh, much better. So, the idea of the healthy commons is there are things that we share in common, right? We share the earth, we share the land, we share the water. How do we work collectively to protect those things? So Zoe goes to the Denver Green School, and wouldn't you know it, they're teaching westward expansion in the 3rd grade, right? And I'm like, oh, really? Because we just did this, and we just did it really well, and it was awesome, and now she's going to sit in class and do it all over again. Well, Cartel Jaquette, her teacher, definitely did lay down some background knowledge about what happened for Native America and the pioneers and that sort of thing. And then Mr. Jaquette did something that rocked my daughter's world. And it rocked my world, and it's very Denver Green School. He taught the unit from the perspective of Buffalo, right? And if you think about multiculturalism being about inviting multiple perspectives, think about the power of children looking at westward expansion from these three frameworks. It was really quite a beautiful, it was a really beautiful and exciting thing for my daughter and for me, and hopefully for all the kids. So I just want to ask all of the educators in the room that when you think about doing multiculturalism, please don't stop with heroes and holidays, food and festivals, folklore and fables. Please don't stop there, and maybe don't even start there, because there is a wonderful way to do a kind of teaching and learning that is going to build those academic skills you care about, that's going to allow children to really look at issues from multiple perspectives, and that is going to enable them to sort of think very critically. And doing multicultural education really, at the end of the day, is about empowering our children to be really prepared to participate in our diverse democracy. Thank you very much.
We now look at how, as educators, we can stress multiculturalism in the curriculum development. One of the big areas is reality and representation. The persistent concern of curriculum development in all subjects is helping students understand the realities of the social condition and how they came to be. Historically, curriculum designers have been more exclusive than inclusive of the wide range of ethnic and cultural diversity that exists within society. What we need to do as educators is show that the reality of ethnic, racial, and cultural groups and all the things that occur. So I'll give you one example, and that is the globe. If we look at the globe and we see that, that there are realities to it that are incorrect, and we need to break that out. So what I want to do is I want to show you a video real quick that came from the movie, the TV show called The West Wing. And it was a fiction, the TV show is, but this section is actually historically accurate. And it talks about the way we perceive the globe and the reality of the globe. So at this point, let me show you a video on the reality of the globe that we see.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Sorry to be late.
Not a problem.
I'm C.J. Craig.
Of course you are. I'm Dr. John Fallow. This is Dr. Cynthia Sales and Professor Donald Huke.
Huke?
Huke.
Okay, and you are the Organization of Cartographers for Social Equality.
Well, we're from the OCSE. We have many members.
How many?
4,300 dues-paying members.
What are the dues?
$20 a year for the newsletter.
Let's start.
Wait, I want to see this.
This is Josh Lyman.
Indeed you are.
Josh, this is Dr. Fallow, and
Hi.
Who's Merry Men.
Yes.
Should we begin?
Yes. Plain and simple, we'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done.
Really?
No. Why are we changing maps?
Because, CJ, the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But
Yes.
it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes?
Here we have Europe, drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing is where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time. Should we continue?
Uh-huh.
So, you're probably wondering what all of this has to do with social equality.
No, I'm wondering where France really is.
Guys, we want to thank you very much for coming in.
Hang on, we're gonna finish this.
Okay.
What do maps have to do with social equality, you ask?
She asked.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power.
I'm going to check in on Toby.
Go.
These guys find Brigadoon on that map, you'll call me, right?
Probably not.
Okay.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere and the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the Northern Hemisphere but on the top?
On the bottom.
How?
Like this.
Yeah, but you can't do that.
Why not?
Because it's freaking me out.
So what we see with that video is that reality can be skewed. And with the example of the European map, we see that up and down is actually can be flipped, because when you get into space, there is no up and down in space. So why don't we just flip the globe upside down? And that's one argument that they make with that. In fact, if you're ever curious why it was designed that way, Europe, the cartographers in Europe, especially in Germany, made the globe and made sure they put Europe on top. So that's why you would kind of changes your mind whenever you see the reality of the globe and the way it's supposed to be viewed. Also, we need to get away from, and that's what this section right here talks about, we need to get away from just skimming the topic in our textbooks. Textbooks, for the most part, that, like, for example, during World War II, the Japanese Americans were interned. And when they were interned, textbooks always say that. They'll say Japanese Americans were interned and that was bad, which it was, obviously. But the textbooks don't go in depth on that. That when you look at the Japanese American internment, you also see literature and poetry that they wrote, and there's stories behind that. So we don't need to just say, well, we treated Native Americans, we treated Japanese Americans, we treated African Americans wrong. We need to also go into their culture. Of course, this will be countered with that we do not have time for that because we have to worry about state testing. And that's a discussion to have at a later time, that maybe we need to get away from state testing. But we're also seeing that state testing is becoming more multicultural as well. They're wanting to see that you understand, that students understand different cultures in society, and that's why there's more questions on civil rights and Japanese American internment. There will be a video at the end of this section right here which will talk about the Japanese Americans and how they were their different culture. So just looking at this video upcoming right now, it talks about Chinese Americans and how they were treated during World War II. Many of y'all didn't even know this was going on. And that's what history books always skip over. So let me just show you a clip on Chinese Americans and what they did during World War II while Japanese Americans were interned, and just see if you even understood this was going on during World War II. And this shows you more of a reality that was going on.
The night after December the 7th, the federal agents came in. They wanted the Japanese people. They just questioned everybody, what are you, Chinese or Jap? Chinese or Jap? So I tell them, I'm Chinese, let me see an ID. I gave them the ID, one, okay. The two Japanese fellas that I was rooming with, they took them away.
They were rounding up the Japanese for the internment camps. And we were told not to leave Chinatown, and that if we did leave it, that we wore our buttons that proclaimed American Chinese.
December 7th, 1941, was a calamity for the American Navy in Honolulu and for Japanese Americans. Perversely, it would be Chinese America's deliverance. For 4 years, China had been at war with Japan. Suddenly, China was our ally. The goodwill spilled over to the Chinese here. Now they were the good Asians.
Could be better life in the service because of civilian. At that time, either laundry or restaurant business. So by going to the service, I could be somebody else.
There was tremendous shortage of labor because most of male went to war.
Here is where the victory is born, in the factories of American industry going full blast.
And so Chinese, for the first time, are able to, in large number, work alongside American workers. And the whites have the opportunity to see the Chinese as real individuals rather than this horrible image of them as aliens. It is a very sad twist of fate that Japanese Americans now are the bad guys, the place that the Chinese used to have.
From San Francisco's huge Chinatown comes a steady flow of patriotic Americans of Chinese descent, eager to register for work in vital wartime industry.
There were 7 shipyards in the Bay Area, and they needed workers to help build ships. So Chinese women ended up, for the first time, taking on jobs like welders and riveters and burners and flangers.
One of my aunts was one of these riveters, and I remember she just gloried in the fact that she was working for good money now.
Patriotic fervor swept through Chinatown. But there were still 15 anti-Chinese laws on the books. What to make of them? They were now an embarrassment among allies. And in 1943, with FDR's support, a bill repealing exclusion sailed through Congress. This historic event barely earned a headline. Even Chinese Americans had other things on their minds.
We were getting ready to be shipped overseas, and I think all of a sudden people were becoming colorblind because suddenly they realized that we're going to really have to hang together or die.
Ark Chin was one of thousands of young replacements thrown into the European front in the winter of '44.
Fear never leaves you. One time we went into a hollow. The guys were tired. They wanted to rest. I said, now guys, let's get the hell out of here. Sure enough, as soon as we got out of there, the mail came in. So after that, I didn't have any problem with my squad. They followed me. So that was a sense of realization that I had become somebody more than I had started with. Coming back, first of all, I survived. Later, back in the restaurant, we went through another one of those incidents where the rednecks said, "We fought goddamn more for you chinks." I said, "What? I was out there. You know, I fought that war."
Veterans came home with new rights. It wasn't just the GI Bill. Now laws are written to allow them and all Chinese with citizenship to bring in wives. Some 65 years after the Exclusion Act, The Chinese here could lead lives that others took for granted. They could become naturalized like other immigrants, could live together like other families. Bachelor society was dying at last.
Chinese mothers present their youngsters in this Chinatown baby parade at San Francisco.
Our children, we sense, been born into a new era. I did not kid myself that still there would be roadblocks. Yeah, it was going to be a struggle, but what the hell, that's life.
The last part we're going to talk about is relevance. So we looked at reality and now relevance. You have to teach to students why this is important to them in their everyday lives. Students from different ethnic groups are more likely to be interested and engaged in learning situations that occur in familiar and friendly frameworks than in those occurring in strange and hostile ones. A key factor in establishing educational relevance for these students is cultural similarity and responsiveness. This would translate to mean you need to know where your students are coming from. You can do this with interest inventories or just understanding and learning the different types of cultures of your students. I have encouraged all of my student teachers as they move up into the teaching ranks to see if you can do a ride-along on the school buses with the school district and just say, hey, I would like to ride one of the routes just one day. What you'll see then is you'll get to experience what the students are going through, not only on the school bus, but you get to see where they're living and you get to see their homes. It'll actually break your heart sometimes when you see the types of home lives that these students go through. Some of these students are living in very poor situations, but remembering and realizing what they're going through will help you understand their culture. Students who come from different educational environments will also affect the way they're going to learn. I had a student one time tell me, all I want to do is graduate so I can be the first person in my family to ever graduate high school. So you see what's relevant to this young man is the need to graduate. Using a variety of strategies that may seem a tall order in any classroom. But what you really want to do is become a better teacher by being more culturally responsive. Scholars are producing powerful descriptions of culturally relevant teaching. There's all type of multicultural education that's going through. One key word that you'll see a lot is achievement gap. And what they're saying is that when students are not, there's an achievement gap between different culture groups. And we need to close the achievement gap. I'm going to add, I can add a web link later on to Achievement Gap, but you can also do a YouTube search on that and you can see the different type of achievement gaps that are going on. But I will add a video to the end of this lecture along with the Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois on the achievement gap so that you'll see what that's talking about and how we can respond to that. Another thing that many people talk about is cross-curriculum connections or multidisciplinary. You'll see that a lot whenever you're looking at multiculturalism education. What they're talking about when they talk about cross-curriculum connections is, that's a key term that you'll see a lot, is are you teaching, for example, social studies and connecting that to English? So this next video is actually going to show you multicultural education with cross-curriculum connections. And they're talking about agricultural and they're talking about botany and A&P as well as areas like that. So you may want to think about doing that whenever you're teaching lessons, is cross-curriculum connections. So let's look at it real quick on a video, what they're talking about. And this video is integrating studies, sustainable, and cross-curriculum connections. So you're going to see a little cross-curriculum connection.
The social, economic, environmental needs of this generation. That in and of itself is important to teach. From an education perspective, we're experiencing increased engagements across a variety of disciplines.
You can trim both of these right there. You still have, right, the leaf. This is the leaf. Filled with chloroplast will be photosynthesis. This, though, is the shoot that's going to keep growing. Make sense? Yeah.
When I first got up here, we weren't even using the term sustainability. We were recycling, we were composting, and then we started tying it a little more into the classes.
So these are part energy.
Then I realized if we were to really look at all the different facets of sustainability, certainly the social and economic, in the biology class we wouldn't get to all the other things we had to teach. So I put out an email to teachers to see who was interested in having a conversation around using the concept of sustainability to make cross-disciplinary connections. A dozen teachers came together after school on their own time to start talking about what can we do here on the campus to really model sustainability. The idea of food production came up pretty quick. We use the overarching theme of sustainability to provide this context.
We have greens, and what eats our greens other than us? Aphids consume some of that, and ladybugs eat the aphids.
We use the food system as a vehicle to generate these experiential lessons. They're standards-based.
You need to be able to let the air get at the roots.
So teachers were involved from the beginning on a voluntary level. Then we started finding different ways to tie in other classes, other teachers, and said, hey, while we're doing this, in biology, looking at maybe these ecological implications, maybe you can look at some of the economic pieces that are driving it.
What's cool about public banks is that they're not just a way to reduce inequality, but they're also a way to promote sustainability in our state. So sustainability is really important to me, and it's sort of surprising to me that it's not important to all economists, because economics is the study of how to use scarce resources to fulfill infinite human wants and needs. A priority of a public bank would be to make low-interest loans to small businesses. Imagine that TJ and Tabitha decide to start a business growing and selling wheat. They could then get a small loan from the public bank, so you get that wealth creation, but you don't have the wealth extraction because the interest ends up staying right here.
We were going to do this irrigation system, so we wanted some type of alternative energy to power the pump that was out there. So I tossed that over to Ann Watson, the physics teacher, and said, hey, this is what we're looking for. You want to tie this into your curriculum?
And I said, well, maybe we could make this a feasibility study for my students.
We need to write a table of the data that you're going to collect.
And so we, as a class, came to some conclusions, one of them being that the school should look into getting photovoltaics or solar panels.
They raised the money for it and ultimately worked with the company to install those panels.
Now, for my physics classes, we're looking at what the production rate is, and is that space sustainable in terms of electricity? Are we producing enough to meet the needs of that space?
So you've got biomass, waste. What's the third one?
Respiration?
Yeah. Heat and respiration, right?
We introduced students to the greenhouse in biology, focusing on nutrient cycles as well as plant physiology, anatomy.
Make a flow chart of that energy that's coming into the greenhouse.
Right now we're doing a unit on the biosphere. We're looking at energy transfer.
We can use something from
the biomass from those consumers when they die goes into the ground and can be used by the producers and their nutrients from their body.
Yeah, the key word there is nutrients. Decomposers are really good at returning these things back to the system.
Over the years, though, we worked hard to give them a number of different options of classes from AP Spanish to algebra, in which they would have a broader experience with sustainability and food production.
It doesn't matter how long I stand at the front of the room and talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration if they have no context in which to think about those things. Being able to go out to the greenhouse and really see those things in action makes the learning that much more meaningful.
I would encourage teachers to find those ties between what they're doing and someone else's class or curriculum. We can create these opportunities for each other as teachers.
The last part of this article is a summary of why multicultural education is important. As you read this chapter, you'll see the word achievement gap emerge a lot. And when we look at achievement gap, we see that it deals with students who may or may not be achieving at the same level as everyone else. And that's become the big issue, is why is achievement gap present? Why are there subgroups in our society that are not doing as well as other groups when we look at test scores? So as educators, we need to address achievement gap. This next video will show you achievement gap and how you as an educator can bring in multicultural education into your classroom and address achievement gap.
Classroom performance and achievement. These are two issues separated by huge disparities in our educational system. How we bridge the achievement gap for children of color will ultimately determine the success of America's future generations.
We are pretending as if we don't know that kids in lower income communities have less well-prepared teachers.
So we need schools that are student-centered and always factor in the human element. So we need to adapt to the students rather than always want the kids to adapt to us.
Teachers, have the high expectations of yourself. If you're going to expect them to jump high, you have to be up there to help them.
Why does achievement gap exist? Teachers, whatever your profession is, counselors, administrators, whatever, you have been ill-prepared to work with populations that don't look like you.
That is the reality chipping away at our education system stability. Many studies and statistics show there is a widening chasm that does not permit equitable education for children of various racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds.
When you take unstandardized children from unstandardized backgrounds and unstandardized systems and give them a standardized test to determine their future, you can either determine that we have lost our mind and we're just too stupid to understand what it is we're doing. My goodness, why would we do that? Sounds so ridiculous. Or you can conclude that there's something about that that's quite deliberate.
We use the word achievement gap, and I used it for this conference for one purpose only, and that was because if I called it a debt owed to low-income minorities and other people who haven't had opportunity, no one would show up.
Leading researchers from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College invited other education thought leaders to share real-world strategies with educators. For several days, teachers and school administrators were given tools to help understand and bridge the achievement gap.
So rather than focusing on telling people to catch up, I think we have to talk about how we will begin to pay down the mountain of debt that we have amassed at the expense of entire groups of people and their subsequent generations.
We have to get to move teachers to a place where they really get to relate to their students, know how to relate, but then not only relating just for a relationship standpoint, but relationships to improve academic achievement, because students want to know, one, do you care about me first? And then if I know you care about me, then I'll go with you.
Some factors that affect school performance may be beyond the control of the child or parents.
The achievement gap begins in the mother's womb. Before they even come out. You know why? Healthcare, housing.
Can you imagine a kid sitting in a classroom not having eaten since yesterday at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and now you're at school at 9 o'clock the next morning, and you want them to pay attention 5 hours later? Not going to happen. They're waiting for lunch.
The data and support are there for educators, school administrators, and communities to begin closing the achievement gap.
And if it's of interest to Vanderbilt, it becomes of interest to other institutions around the country. I think institutions of higher learning like Vanderbilt can work with their local school districts, and not only that, creating a workforce in terms of in-service teachers that work in these settings that will be able to hit the ground running.
There may be a price to pay if we continue to undereducate children of color and underfund schools in their neighborhoods.
Because in 25 years, it's going to be a half people of color, half white country. That's just a fact. If we are still as unequal, profoundly unequal then as we are today, we're not going to survive as a country. Bottom line, you can't maintain a healthy economy if half the population is twice as likely as the other half to be unemployed, 3 times as likely to be poor, 1/20th the net worth, double the rate of infant mortality, 9 years less life expectancy. You can't. So we have to have solidarity or we don't survive. I mean, it's that simple. It's equity or destruction. Those are the two choices, and that's it.
All right, so this lecture has taught you about multicultural education. I'm going to put this lecture on YouTube as well, so we can link that, or you can download the MP4. Your homework assignment will be to read this PDF that I'll attach to the lecture, but also to answer these 5 questions at the end of the chapter. You can do this in a Word document. You can upload it from there. But this is a very interesting topic when you look at teaching as a whole. But multicultural education, the key is do not view it as an add-on to the class, but view it as something that we need to put into all of our curriculum on a daily basis. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and have a good day.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. On February 23rd, it will be the 145th anniversary of the birth of W.E.B. Du Bois. He's been known as the father of the American Civil Rights Movement, the founder of Pan-Africanism, and a figure of both controversy and one of great, you could say, adulation. Now joining us to talk about the life of Du Bois and what he means to us today is Anthony Montero. He's a professor of African American Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
So why, of many leaders in African American history, there's only a real few that have kind of lasted the century and still remain, it seems, so relevant to today. Why is that true of Du Bois?
I think that's so because he contributed on multiple levels to African American struggles and to the transformation of America. He was this great scholar, the first person to get a PhD from Harvard, and he writes his dissertation on the transatlantic slave trade, and then he writes probably the first scientific work of urban sociology, the Philadelphia Negro, and then he goes on to found what is in the 20th century the first civil rights organization, the Niagara Movement. It is this tremendous intellectual and scholarly production that puts him on the map. But then on top of it, he is this unbelievable activist. Everything from civil rights to Pan-Africanism to labor rights, and ultimately anti-imperialism and socialism. So he lives 95 years, and he's productive for a good part of that time, and he's left a tremendous legacy and made a tremendous impact.
Let me first of all tell viewers, we're going to sometime in the next couple of months really work our way through the history of Du Bois and go through all the big beats of his life. Right now, we're just going to focus on a few things in a couple of segments leading up to the anniversary of his birth. So talk about his split with Booker T. Washington and what that was about.
Yeah, that's an important split at the beginning of the 20th century. He really crystallizes it in one of the chapters in his famous book, The Souls of Black Folk. And he differed with Booker Washington on the issue of education, higher education in particular, whether or not the black college elite should be given a liberal education equal to that white elites were getting in the top white universities. But he also differed on the question of whether or not black folk should sacrifice civil rights and voting rights for the promise of support from Northern capital for economic and vocational training in the South.
Yeah, talk a bit about what this was actually codified in something called the Atlanta Compromise, right?
Oh, yeah. The Atlanta Compromise speech, and Du Bois named it that. And it was this grand compromise that Booker T. Washington conceived. He said, look, the nation is not willing to grant us voting rights and civil rights, that is the North and South. We're not prepared to live up to the promise of Reconstruction. So he said, look, let's forget that. The nation needed black labor in the past, and as it industrializes, it will need black labor in the future. And what we must do, and what black leadership must do, is to prepare black people for the coming industrialization and the need for labor that the future held. Du Bois believed, however, that the bargain cost black people too much, that we could not give up civil and political rights, that even if conceivably economic benefit would come from it, we could not defend those economic benefits unless we had the vote, unless we were full citizens, unless we had civil rights.
The Atlanta Compromise had actually accepted segregation as a legitimate thing. That was part of the deal, wasn't it?
And Booker Washington anticipated by about a year the Plessy v. Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court, which legalized and said it was constitutional to separate the races under the fiction of separate and equal. What it actually did, and I think Du Bois anticipated this, was to protect white privilege.
So Du Bois becomes a very public figure, if I understand it correctly, by the early 20th century. He's amongst a couple of the most well-known African Americans. And he, in fact, I guess next to Booker T. Washington, who he opposes. And is this, in many ways, the roots of the civil rights movement, then?
Oh, yes, it is. Because the path of Booker T. Washington was the path of denying or repudiating the struggle for civil rights, at least for the foreseeable future. The path that Du Bois and his followers adopt is the path of the fight for civil rights. So if, let us say, black folk had chosen in the 20th century, as we went forward, the path of Booker T. Washington, conceivably we would have never had a civil rights movement.
And do you see a reflection of Booker T. Washington type of interest and ideology today? Is there a reflection of that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think among sections of the black middle class and petty bourgeoisie, there are strong resonances of Booker Washington. I argue that the race policies, if you want to call them that, of the Obama administration have more in common with Booker T. Washington's conceptualization of things than they do with either Du Bois or Martin Luther King or the civil rights movement of the 60s.
What's an example of that?
You take his State of the Union speech, where he talks about opportunity if you work hard. You take the example, which parallels this, of counseling black folk, that what you need to do is clean up your cultural act, clean up your behavior, and then you will have greater opportunity for fitting in to the middle class and the opportunities that are afforded to it.
We'll work to strengthen families by removing the financial deterrence to marriage for low-income couples, and do more to encourage fatherhood. Because what makes you a man isn't the ability to conceive a child, it's having the courage to raise one.
This is neo-Booker T. Washingtonism. And what it does is the opposite of what Du Bois was doing in the Niagara movement, which was to question the color line and to point to the color line and racial disparity and racial inequality as the source of the problems that black people face. The Washingtonites and the Obamaites argue that the problems are not generated externally, but are rooted in the black community itself.
Yeah, you saw that within that back and forth with Reverend Wright, then candidate Obama, I guess it was, more or less talked about being in a post-racial society, that somehow Reverend Wright was stuck in the past.
That's right. That's right. And that's the great Philadelphia speech that he gives in 2008 on race, which a lot of liberals and even progressives celebrated. But what it was a Booker T. Washington type of speech.
Well, this is just the beginning of a discussion about the life of Du Bois. So please join us for the next part of this interview with Anthony Montero on the Real News Network.